Welcome to the Deep Dive, your shortcut to being well-informed. We cut through the noise to deliver truly insightful takeaways. Today we're diving into a topic that's it's right at the intersection of incredible medical innovation, really personal choices, and some, frankly, quite intricate regulations. Modern medicine is always evolving. It opens up amazing possibilities, but it also presents us with complex decisions, especially around building a family. Our focus today, egg donation. And specifically, how it all works in the unique context of Singapore. Because, you see, there was a pretty big shift there back in 2020. Singapore lifted its previous age limits on women getting IVF treatment. And that change, it's expected to lead to a steady rise in egg donation cases, particularly for, older women maybe nearing or past menopause who might not be producing enough viable eggs naturally.
Yeah, exactly. So think of this deep dive as your guide, really, to understanding the landscape, the different pathways and options available if you're considering egg donation in Singapore. Our goal here is to pull out the most crucial bits of knowledge, the key insights, to help you get properly informed on what's, let's face it, a sensitive and nuanced subject. We're aiming for clarity, definitely. Maybe a few surprises, too.
Absolutely. So, okay, what does this all mean for you, the listener? Let's unpack this journey together. We're going to walk through pretty much everything you need to know, from the legal side of things that shape the process, right through those really deep personal questions that come up with donor conception.
Okay, so when we talk about egg donation in Singapore, one of maybe the most striking things is just how specific and frankly strict the criteria are for the donors themselves. For instance, the donation has to be purely altruistic,
right?
Which basically means the donor cannot get any money, any compensation for her eggs. That's fundamental there.
That's a big one.
It is. And beyond that, she needs to be between 21 and 37 years old. That applies whether she's donating fresh eggs or, had them frozen earlier. And interestingly, she doesn't actually need to be a Singapore citizen or a permanent resident, which does broaden the potential donor pool a bit.
That altruistic part, yeah, that's incredibly important. Really sets Singapore apart in some ways. But the scrutiny, it doesn't stop there, does it? The health screening, wow, it's rigorous.
Oh, absolutely rigorous.
We're talking comprehensive tests, a whole list of infectious diseases. Like donors have to test negative for HIV, hepatitis B and C, syphilis, cytomegalovirus, both IgG and IgM, I think.
That's right, checking for active or past infection to make sure the donor isn't carrying viruses that could affect the child.
And her urine too, right? Negative for gonorrhea, chlamydia, CMV.
Yep.
Stringent list. Really reflects Singapore's focus on donor and child health. Makes it one of the safest places globally for this, arguably.
Yes, definitely.
And there's also a cap, isn't there? Her donated eggs can't result in more than 5 live births.
Correct. That's a measure to limit the number of children conceived from any one donor. And the process itself involves quite careful preparation for the donor. Before she can even sign the consent form, she has to go through mandatory psychological assessment and counseling.
Not just a tick box exercise then.
Not at all. It's really to make sure she fully understands the implications, the weight of her decision. And if she's married, her husband also has to attend the counseling and co-sign the consent form.
Right.
And to really give her time to think it through, there's even a mandatory 1-week break, a hiatus between the counseling session and actual signing the form. Just provides that crucial pause for reflection.
That makes sense. Beyond the rules, though, there are these huge personal family issues that recipients have to grapple with. For a woman thinking about egg donation, it must start with a lot of soul searching. Asking yourself, does she genuinely want a child through this very specific process? The really key question here, I imagine, is she being pressured, maybe by her partner or in-laws?
That's a critical point because, for a marriage to work, both partners really need to be fully on board. If one person is unwilling, it can just lead to so much unhappiness down the line, especially when there's an innocent child involved. And then there's the big discussion, whether and when to tell the child about how they were conceived.
Ah, yes, the telling question.
Right. Most experienced fertility counselors strongly recommend telling the child the truth. Probably around the time they reach school-going age. There's just so much research, psychological studies, news reports, documenting the emotional trauma, the identity crises that donor-conceived teens and adults can go through if they find out unexpectedly.
Yeah, maybe during a stressful family fight or something.
Exactly. And that often leads to really strained relationships, sometimes even estranged parent-child relationships.
And keeping that secret. It's just getting harder and harder in today's world, isn't it?
It really is.
With the boom and popularity of those direct-to-consumer genetic testing kits, ancestry websites.
Precisely. It makes it much more difficult to hide the truth from donor offspring. There's a very real chance a child could stumble upon the truth just by connecting with DNA-matched relatives they find on these sites.
Wow.
And you can kind of see a future where DNA testing becomes, a universal thing in healthcare, making these secrets practically impossible to keep.
Okay, so given all those considerations, what are the actual options on the table for patients in Singapore?
Well, currently, one of the most popular routes is actually traveling overseas for egg donation, going to a foreign fertility clinic.
Right.
The medical fees abroad can often be quite a bit cheaper than in Singapore, and that's obviously a big draw for many people.
That lower cost, yeah, definitely attractive. Yeah. But I guess there are trade-offs.
Absolutely. You can't use the government co-funding schemes,
Right.
nor can you tap into your CPF, your Central Provident Fund, the National Pension Scheme for fertility treatment if it's done overseas.
Oh, right.
Plus, obviously, there's the hassle and the cost of international travel, hotel stays, all that.
Sure.
Although, interestingly, some local Singaporean clinics do have partnerships with foreign clinics, often in Malaysia maybe, and they can help coordinate some parts, like the hormonal injections needed to prepare the womb for the embryo transfer. So you might do some of the lead-up locally.
I see. That makes sense.
This also brings up the topic of pre-implantation genetic testing, or PGTA.
Right, screening the embryo.
Yeah, so PGTA lets patients screen embryos for major chromosomal abnormalities before they're transferred. And in some countries, you can even select the sex of the embryos, which is banned in Singapore, by the way.
Oh, okay.
But it's highly restricted here in Singapore. Overseas, though, it's often readily available.
But how useful is PGTA for egg donation cases specifically?
That's a crucial point. PGTA is actually completely useless for preventing most heritable genetic diseases from the egg donor. It only looks for those big chromosomal issues like Down syndrome, not specific gene mutations. In fact, arguably, it might be largely unnecessary for egg donation cases if you're using eggs from young donors, because they naturally have a very low chance of chromosomal abnormalities anyway.
Right, this is where it gets particularly insightful, because some foreign IVF clinics, unfortunately, might sort of play on patients' anxieties, right? Worries about unknown genetic diseases.
Exactly.
To push expensive PGTA, and conveniently forget to mention that a simpler, often more relevant test genetic carrier screening of the donor's blood is usually a much better way to check for those specific inherited conditions.
That's spot on. It's definitely something to be wary of.
Yeah.
And also, patients should probably be aware that some clinics might take an extra cut, a profit margin, when they source donors from external agencies. It might actually work out cheaper to contact those foreign egg donor agencies directly if you're exploring that route.
Good tip.
And another practical tip, if you go down this path, try, if possible, to use egg donors who actually live locally in the same city as the foreign IVF.
Instead of flying them in.
Right. Traveling donors are just much harder to monitor throughout the whole process, making sure they're taking injections properly and so on.
Okay, that makes sense. What about other options, like using family or friends?
Yeah, that's another avenue to consider. Seeking out relatives or close friends as potential egg donors. The most obvious advantage of using a blood relative, say a sister or cousin, is you maintain that genetic link to the child conceived. And you'd also likely know about any hereditary genetic diseases that might run in the family, which can add a layer of comfort, perhaps.
Sure. But finding someone who's young enough, that could be tricky, right? Most clinics prefer donors under 30 for the best chance of success.
That's a challenge, yes. Finding someone suitable among your own friends and relatives who fits that ideal age bracket can be difficult. Using older egg donors, well, it would naturally decrease your chances of success.
And the DNA share is interesting, too. Like, an egg from your full sister means your child shares about 25% of your DNA.
Roughly, yes, compared to 50% if it were your own egg. And it drops further for a half-sister or niece, maybe 12.5%, first cousin around 6.25%.
Right.
And what about using a friend? Well, the benefits there might be knowing her character, what she looks like, traits that could potentially be inherited.
Right.
But the downsides, well, you lose donor anonymity completely, and there's maybe a higher chance of the secret of the child's conception getting out, deliberately or accidentally.
Yeah, that could be awkward.
It could. Donation from close relatives or friends can definitely introduce awkwardness, even tension, into future family relationships, especially at big family gatherings, Something to really think about.
Definitely. Okay, so another option that seems to be gaining traction is importing frozen donor eggs from overseas egg banks.
Yes, that's a more recent development and increasingly popular. It is now permitted in Singapore.
Ah, good to know.
Provided the egg banks meet specific requirements, of course, like really rigorous infectious disease screenings similar to local standards.
And the advantages there.
Clear advantages. Donor anonymity is maintained, which many prefer, and there's a huge choice of donors available globally, including many Asian and Chinese donors, actually, because demand is increasing.
Right.
Some egg banks are even quite close by, like in Malaysia, specifically set up to service Singaporean patients.
Okay.
The major plus points of using frozen eggs compared to fresh ones include convenience, mainly. There's no need to synchronize the donors and the recipient's hormonal cycles.
Ah, that sounds tricky logistically.
It can be, yeah. So using frozen eggs avoids that. It also means no travel and hotel costs that often come with fresh egg donation involving foreign donors.
Makes sense.
Plus, there's usually little to no waiting time once you've picked your eggs,
Yeah.
and you have certainty about the exact number of frozen eggs you're actually getting, which isn't always guaranteed with a fresh donation cycle.
Okay, sounds good. But I'm guessing there are downsides to imported frozen eggs, too.
Oh, for sure. Important to be aware of these. The transport costs alone can be very high.
Right. Shipping frozen eggs.
Exactly. Needs special cryogenic containers, basically, super-cooled flasks, and there's a lot of paperwork to get them through customs without being x-rayed, which could damage the eggs.
Wow.
And crucially, IVF success rates with frozen eggs, well, they're still significantly lower than with fresh eggs.
Even with new freezing methods.
Even with advances like vitrification, that flash freezing method that reduces ice crystals and improves survival rates, frozen eggs are just very delicate. The thawing protocol has to exactly match the freezing protocol for the best results.
So ideally, the same lab does both.
Ideally, yes. For the best outcome, using the same IVF lab that did the freezing and the thawing is recommended.
Okay.
And not all frozen eggs will even survive the thawing process. Typically, maybe out of 10, 8 or 9 might make it through.
Right. Still a loss.
Still a loss. And finally, Asian or Chinese donor eggs can sometimes be more expensive if you're sourcing them from Western egg banks just due to scarcity there. Though using Asian banks can help with that cost.
Okay. So that brings us to options that are less advisable. Or maybe just outright risky.
Yeah, we should touch on things that are strictly not recommended, and frankly very risky, like looking for a secretly paid egg donor, or using a foreign agency to somehow send a donor to Singapore under the radar.
Sounds dicey.
It is. There are websites out there that might seem to help you find your own donor, but they're unlikely to be free. And paying someone under the table, well, it gives you zero legal recourse if they don't follow through.
Right.
But more importantly, since payment for egg donation is illegal in Singapore, you'd actually be implicating yourself in a criminal offense.
Exactly. And beyond the legal risk, how do you even ensure a sort of freelance donor actually follows through with the demanding daily hormone injections needed? It sounds hard to manage.
Incredibly difficult. Now, using a well-established foreign agency might seem safer in that regard, but it's way more expensive. You've got agency fees, travel, accommodation for the donor, often a coordinator to make sure she complies. But the bigger issue is still the illicit payments. If those secret transactions ever came to light, you could face serious legal trouble.
Has that happened before in Singapore?
There's precedent, yes. Individuals have been jailed and fined for paying organ donors, for example.
Wow. Okay.
Furthermore, Singaporean IVF clinics require both the recipient and the donor to sign a formal declaration stating the donation is purely altruistic.
So signing that, knowing money changed hands.
Would mean committing perjury, making a false declaration, and potentially bribery too. It's simply not worth the immense risk involved.
Absolutely not. Okay, so is there a fifth option? Something maybe for the future?
Well, there's a fifth possibility, but it's more of a future potential right now. And that's using donated, unused, surplus frozen eggs from former elective egg freezing patients at local fertility clinics.
Ah, women who froze their eggs for themselves earlier.
Exactly. Currently, these donated eggs are very scarce in Singapore. But studies from overseas suggest that the vast majority of women who do elective egg freezing, freezing eggs, often to preserve fertility while they pursue careers or wait for the right partner, they often don't end up using those frozen eggs.
Interesting.
And some of them might eventually choose to donate them altruistically. So it's possible this source could become more readily available down the track.
And it's not just from elective freezers, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes single women facing early menopause or medical treatments like chemo might freeze eggs as a backup.
That's right, fertility preservation for medical reasons.
Mm-hmm.
Or even some married couples undergoing IVF might choose to freeze excess unfertilized eggs instead of embryos. Maybe for religious or personal reasons, viewing frozen embryos as living entities.
Okay.
Contingency freezing can also happen if, say, a husband can't produce a sperm sample on the day of the egg extraction.
But a key point here, I guess, is quality. Patients would naturally use their best quality eggs for their own treatment first.
That's the caveat, yes. So any leftover eggs that might get donated are often of, questionable quality, something to bear in mind.
Right. Okay. So, as you can hear, the world of egg donation in Singapore is, it's remarkably complex, isn't it? And so deeply personal. We've gone through the really strict altruistic rules and the health screening for donors.
Mm-hmm.
And those critical personal decisions for recipients, especially that big one about telling the child.
Yeah.
And we've walked through the different options available. They're diverse, but quite distinct, really, from traveling overseas, importing frozen eggs, even the options that are not recommended, or perhaps those future possibilities.
And understanding the nuances, the pros and cons of each option is just so key to navigating this journey successfully. It's vital, really, to consider not just the medical side, but also all those ethical, social, and deeply personal implications we've touched on. Informed decision-making is paramount.
So what does this all mean for you? Well, hopefully, armed with this deep dive, you feel better equipped now to understand the landscape. And maybe to ask the right questions if this is a path you're considering or just curious about.
And perhaps a final thought to leave you with, building on what we discussed about genetic testing becoming so accessible. As genetic information becomes almost universally available, it really raises an important question, doesn't it? Beyond the medical rules, beyond the legal frameworks, how will we continue to adapt to these evolving definitions of family and identity in this age of donor conception?
That is a truly thought-provoking question to mull over. We really encourage you to continue your own exploration of this topic. Perhaps seek further expert advice if needed, or just engage in discussions based on what you've learned from this deep dive today.